Doctor enters room of woman in coma. Nurse sees something disturbing and calls 911. On a bustling evening at Horizon Care Hospital, Nurse Emily Hart moved through her rounds, just as she did on any typical night shift. But something about Dr. Anderson, the respected chief endocrinologist, caught her attention. His secretive visits to a comatose patient, his abrupt dismissals, and the mysterious vial he repeatedly concealed in his pocket seemed like peculiar doctor eccentricities at first. However, as Emily observed her patient's vitals mysteriously decline, Dr. Anderson's cold demeanor hinted at a darker truth. What Emily would uncover in the hours to come would challenge her faith in the medical profession and force her to choose between her career and a patient's life. Before we dive into this gripping story that may leave you questioning who's truly caring for your loved ones, comment below where you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The fluorescent lights hummed softly in the hospital corridors as Nurse Emily Hart navigated her late-night round. The eerie calm of the floor was interrupted only by the occasional beep of a monitor or the distant squeak of shoes on linoleum. Emily was in a patient's room, chatting with her colleague Mia as they worked. Mia replaced an 4 infusion with practiced efficiency. "Did you hear about Dr. Anderson's new intern?" she whispered, her tone tinged with gossip. "Poor thing looks like she hasn't slept in days." Emily nodded sympathetically. Dr. Anderson's reputation speaks for itself. "I can't imagine working directly under him." Dr. Samuel Anderson, the hospital's chief endocrinologist, was renowned for his brilliance and impossibly high standards. His demanding nature had become legendary among the staff. "I heard he made her redo an entire report because she used the wrong font," Mia continued, shaking her head. "Can you believe that?" Emily was about to respond when the quiet of the night was abruptly shattered. The sound of hurried footsteps and a rattling stretcher echoed through the hallway. Exchanging a glance, Emily and Mia rushed out to see what was happening. A team of paramedics burst through the doors, pushing a stretcher carrying an unconscious woman. Emily's instincts kicked in immediately as she stepped forward. "What do we have?" she asked, matching their pace. "Dorothy Jackson, 55, one paramedic replied, breathless. "Found unconscious at home. Blood sugars through the roof." Emily's heart sank at the sight of the frail woman on the stretcher. Her ashen skin and shallow breathing signaled a dire situation. They rushed Dorothy into the ER, where the once quiet night turned into a whirlwind of activity. "It's almost midnight and she has school tomorrow. You should head home and get some rest too," Emily urged gently. Malcolm hesitated, clearly reluctant, but eventually nodded. "You're right. You go ahead and take the car. I'll catch an Uber later. I want to stay a little longer, make sure Mom's okay." Once the family had left and the night returned to its quiet rhythm, Emily found herself back at the nurse's station, poring over Dorothy's case file. She studied the woman's health history, medications, and recent blood glucose levels, piecing together a more complete picture of her condition. The deeper Emily delved into the file, the stronger the connection she felt to Dorothy's case. The parallels to her grandmother's own battle with diabetes were undeniable. That shared experience pulled Emily in, making her more determined than ever to see Dorothy recover. Setting an alarm on her phone, she resolved to check on Dorothy every few hours. She even memorized the medications listed on her chart, not yet realizing how this growing attachment would soon pull her into a situation that would test her resolve, challenge her beliefs, and change her career path forever. 2 hours later, Emily prepared for another check on Dorothy Jackson. The hospital corridors were quiet, save for the low hum of machines and the occasional soft murmur of passing staff. Gathering her supplies, she walked briskly to Dorothy's room, ready to administer another insulin dose and adjust her 4 fluids. Inside the dimly lit room, Malcolm was still at his mother's bedside. His hand rested lightly over hers as he looked up, his face a mixture of exhaustion and hope. "Any change?" he asked, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Emily reviewed the monitors and vitals before offering him a reassuring smile. Her condition is stabilizing. The treatment seems to be working, but it's a slow process. Mr. Jackson, you should really go home and rest. If there's any change, we'll call you immediately. Malcolm hesitated, torn between staying and the logic of Emily's suggestion. Finally, he stood, his movements slow. You're right, he admitted reluctantly. I just hate leaving her alone. She's not alone, Emily assured him gently. I'll be checking in regularly, and there's always someone nearby if she needs anything. After one last look at his mother, Malcolm nodded and left. Emily watched him go, her heart heavy with empathy, before turning back to her duties. Suddenly, the door opened and Dr. Anderson strode in, his presence commanding the small room. Without looking at Emily, he began a brusque examination of Dorothy. You can leave now, Nurse Hart, he said curtly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Dr. Anderson, are you sure? I was about to, I said leave. He interrupted sharply. Feeling dismissed, Emily hesitated but eventually turned to the door. As she reached it, she heard Dr. Anderson muttering under his breath, his tone harsh. She paused, uneasy, before stepping out into the hallway. Moments later, Dr. Anderson emerged, his narrowed eyes meeting hers. Nurse Hart, he barked, I won't tolerate staff hovering. Return to your station. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment as other staff turned to look. Emily nodded and left, her unease growing with every step. Something about Dr. Anderson's behavior felt deeply wrong, but she couldn't yet put her finger on it. If she was wrong, if there was an innocent explanation for all of this, her career could be ruined. But as Emily thought about Dorothy lying in her hospital bed, so vulnerable and unaware of the potential danger, she knew she couldn't stop now. Every step she took only strengthened her resolve. She had to keep watching, gathering evidence. And when the time came, she would act, because Dorothy's life might depend on it. The weight of her discovery pressed heavily on Emily's mind as she returned to her chair, replaying the night's events in her head. Dr. Anderson's strange dismissals, his sharp reprimands, the mysterious ampoule, and Dorothy's unexplained drops in vitals, all of it painted a picture Emily couldn't ignore. The loneliness of carrying such a heavy suspicion gnawed at her. She felt isolated, burdened by knowledge she wasn't sure how to share. As her eyes wandered down the quiet hallway, they landed on a familiar figure approaching the nurse's station. Mia, a fellow nurse and one of the few people Emily trusted in this sterile, cold environment. On impulse, Emily stood up and called out to her in a low voice. Hey Mia, can I talk to you for a moment? In private? Looking slightly puzzled but willing, Mia nodded. Together, they stepped into a quieter corner, away from prying ears. Emily hesitated, taking a deep breath as she prepared to confide in her. Mia, I think something's not right with Dr. Anderson and one of his patients, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Mia's face lit up with curiosity, mistaking Emily's tone for hospital gossip. Ooh, hospital drama? About Dr. Anderson? Spill. No, Emily hushed her, glancing around. This isn't gossip. I think the new patient, Mrs. Dorothy, is in serious danger. As Emily explained everything, she watched Mia's expression shift from curiosity to surprise, and then to skepticism. When she finished, Mia frowned and crossed her arms. Emily, she said slowly, are you sure you're not overthinking this? Dr. Anderson is the chief endocrinologist. He's handled cases like this dozens of times. Sure, he's tough, but he's got the highest recovery rate in the department. Frustration flickered in Emily's chest. She had hoped for support, someone to validate her concerns. Instead, she felt even more isolated. I know how it sounds, Emily pressed, trying to keep her voice steady. But you haven't seen what I've seen. The way he's acting, the sudden changes in Dorothy's condition, something's not right. Mia sighed, her expression softening but her tone practical. Emily, I know you care about your patients. It's what makes you a great nurse. But accusing Dr. Anderson of malpractice? That's a huge deal. You could ruin your career over this. And if you're wrong, you could destroy his reputation and the hospital's too. Emily bit her lip, the conflict within her growing. She knew Mia was trying to protect her, but the image of Dorothy lying unconscious, her life hanging in the balance, wouldn't let her back down. I know it sounds crazy, Emily admitted, her voice low but resolute. But what if I'm right? What if Mrs. Dorothy is in real danger? Mia looked at her for a long moment before letting out a heavy sigh. Emily, promise me you'll think this through. Don't act on a hunch. You've worked so hard to get here. Don't throw it all away without being absolutely sure. Mia walked away, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. The silence of the corridor was interrupted only by the ticking of the clock, a reminder of the lives that depended on their care. Emily felt torn. Mia's words made sense, but the weight of her suspicions pressed down harder than ever. Suddenly, her alarm beeped, startling her. It was time for another check on Dorothy. Exhausted but determined, Emily stood, silenced her alarm, and gathered her supplies. As she made her way to Dorothy's room, a tall figure in a white coat caught her eye. A nagging thought made her pause. Changing course, Emily hurried to the pharmacy. Her heart raced as she searched the shelves where the glycerin ampoules were stored. When she opened the box, her breath hitched. There were fewer vials than before. Someone had taken another ampoule. Panic surged through her. If Dr. Anderson was planning to administer it again, Dorothy's life was in immediate danger. It felt as though veins of darkness were crawling up from the floor, weaving their way toward the ceiling, cloaking the entire corridor in a grim and oppressive shroud of revelation. Emily's mind reeled as the horrifying truth seemed to consume her entirely. "Dr. Anderson," she asked, her voice trembling, "are you telling me you've been deliberately harming Mrs. Jackson?" Dr. Anderson turned toward her, his venomous gaze piercing. "This isn't all on me," he spat. "I only supplied the glycerin doses. Brandon tampered with her medication and then conveniently left town. When Dorothy administered her insulin, well, we thought it would be quick. Painless. A tragic accident." Emily barely had time to process his words before Malcolm lunged forward, his face a storm of fury and heartbreak. "You monster!" he shouted. "How could you? How could Brandon?" Emily quickly stepped between them, her arms raised to keep them apart. "Mr. Jackson, please," she said firmly. "Your mother needs us right now. We can't help her if we lose control here." Just then, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway as hospital security arrived. Mia had done as Emily asked, calling for backup just in time. The guards moved swiftly, separating Dr. Anderson and Malcolm before the situation could escalate further. Dr. Anderson, however, seemed beyond reason. His anger only grew, and his words became more venomous. "You have no idea what it's like," he snarled. "Dealing with people like you, always complaining, never following instructions, always pretending to care when someone's on their deathbed. You're a burden on the system." Emily stood frozen, horrified, as the esteemed physician's carefully crafted professional facade crumbled before her eyes. His callous justification for the crime revealed not only his misplaced sense of justice, but also a shocking lack of humanity. Malcolm struggled against the guards, his voice trembling with raw fury. "You're a disgrace." Dr. Anderson's cold laughter echoed through the corridor. "Call me whatever you want," he sneered. "But now you know the truth. Your family's neglect is as much to blame as I am. That guilt should haunt you for the rest of your life." Before anyone could respond, the elevator doors slid open, and 2 police officers stepped out. They surveyed the scene with calm professionalism. "What's going on here?" one officer asked, his hand resting on his holster. Emily stepped forward, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around her. "I'm Nurse Emily Hart," she began. "I witnessed Dr. Anderson deliberately administering harmful medication, glycerin, to Mrs. Dorothy Jackson. It's lethal for her condition." The officers exchanged a knowing glance before approaching Dr. Anderson. "Sir," one of them said, "we're going to need you to come with us. You have the right to remain silent." As Dr. Anderson was placed in handcuffs, he didn't go quietly. "You'll regret this, Nurse Hart," he shouted, his voice laced with venom. "I'll make sure you never work in this field again." Emily ignored his threats, her focus shifting back to Dorothy. "Mr. Jackson," she said, turning to Malcolm, "we need to check on your mother. The medical team is still working to stabilize her, and she'll need all our support." Malcolm, his anger giving way to worry, nodded and followed Emily back to Dorothy's room. The scene inside was controlled chaos. Doctors and nurses worked in tandem, fighting to stabilize Dorothy's fragile condition.